Montana Territory, January 1882. There's a cabin near the Bitterroot Range that looks wrong. Not dangerous, not broken, just wrong. From the road, you can see it. A standard log structure, chink-tight, stone chimney, venting steady smoke. But attached to the front door, flapping in the wind like a deflated lung, is something no one's ever seen before. A tunnel, made of canvas, held up by bent willow branches. It sways. It ripples. It looks temporary, and everyone who passes it laughs. But here's the thing no one knew yet. That ridiculous, flapping tunnel was about to rewrite how people thought about heat loss. Because when the coldest stretch of winter hit, when temperatures dropped to 28 below and wind tore through the valley at 50 miles per hour, that stupid tent did something no one expected. It held warm air. All night. What did this trapper understand about thermal barriers that every experienced builder in the region missed? If you want to see how a laughingstock became the most copied design in 2 counties, hit that like button, subscribe for one forgotten survival technique every week, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what you're about to learn could cut your heating bill in half. His name was Emmett Carver, not a builder, not an engineer, just a man who trapped marten and lynx in the high country and came back to his cabin every night half frozen. Emmett's cabin sat at 6,200 feet, tucked into a saddle between 2 ridges where the wind never stopped. It wasn't the cold that wore him down, it was the door. Every time he opened it to bring in firewood, or step out to check his trap line, or just to relieve himself in the snow, the temperature inside dropped. Fast, violently fast. 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Gone. In under 3 minutes. He'd stoke the fire. The cabin would crawl back to 65. Then he'd open the door again. More wood, more water, more pelts to hang. And the heat would pour out like he'd kicked a hole in a dam. By February of 1881, Emmett was burning through a cordwood every 10 days. His neighbors, who lived in similar cabins with similar stoves, were going through a cord every 2 weeks. He was losing, and he knew why. The problem wasn't the door itself. It was geography. His cabin faced northwest. Every time that door swung open, a wall of wind hit the interior like a fist. Cold air didn't seep in. It rushed in, flooding the floor, shoving the warm air up toward the ceiling where it did nothing. He tried a leather curtain. It helped. A little. Maybe 2 degrees. He tried a second door, an outer door made of planks with a 6-inch gap. Better. But not enough. He was still losing 12 degrees per entry. Then, in late autumn of 1881, something happened that wasn't planned. Emmett had been re-waterproofing his canvas tarp, the one he used to cover his wood pile, and he'd stretched it over a frame of willow branches to let the linseed oil cure in the sun. The frame was crude, bent saplings lashed with cordage, just tall enough to walk under. A storm rolled in that night. Heavy wet snow. By morning, the tarp had collapsed into a kind of tunnel. Saggy, ugly, but intact. And when Emmett crawled under it to retrieve his axe, he noticed something. It was warmer in there. Not warm, but warmer. The snow had insulated the canvas. The canvas had trapped a layer of still air. And that still air, dead, unmoving, was a blanket. He stood there, axe in hand, staring at the collapsed tarp. Then he looked at his cabin door. What if? It wasn't a brilliant idea. It was desperation with a frame. Emmett didn't build a vestibule. He built a breathing room. Here's what he did. He took 2 sections of heavy canvas, waxed, double-layered, the kind trappers use for winter shelters, and sewed them into a tube, roughly 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. He reinforced the seams with leather strapping. Then he bent 12 willow saplings into hoops and slid them inside the canvas tube, spacing them every 8 inches. The hoops kept the tunnel open, flexible but open. He attached the tunnel to the cabin's door frame using iron hooks and a plank lintel, sealing the gaps with wool batting and pine tar. The far end of the tunnel, the exterior opening, he left loose. It could be tied shut from the inside or left open, depending on wind. The design was simple. 2 doorways, one at the cabin, one at the outer end of the tunnel. Both could be opened independently. The space between them, that was the trap. When you entered from outside, you stepped into the tunnel, closed the outer flap behind you. then walked 6 feet through still air before opening the cabin door. Cold air entered the tunnel, but it stayed in the tunnel. It didn't flood the interior. When you exited, the reverse happened. Warm air escaped into the tunnel when you opened the cabin door, but it didn't escape to the outside. Not unless you opened both flaps at once, which you didn't. It was a thermal airlock. Crude, improvised, and it looked absolutely ridiculous. The canvas sagged in the wind. The willow frame wobbled. From a distance, it looked like someone had duct-taped a circus tent to their front door. Neighbors riding past would slow their horses just to stare. One man, a freight hauler named Caleb Dodd, stopped entirely. He sat on his horse, tilted his head, and said, loud enough for Emmett to hear from inside, "Looks like your house is trying to crawl away." But here's what Caleb Dodd didn't understand. What none of them understood was the physics of still air. Air is a terrible conductor of heat. If you can stop it from moving, it becomes one of the best insulators on Earth. Goose down works because it traps air. Wool works because it traps air. Double-pane windows work because they trap air. Emmett's tunnel worked because it trapped air. The outer layer of canvas blocked wind. The inner cavity, held open by the willow hoops, created a buffer zone where cold air could sit, unmoving, absorbing the temperature difference between outside and inside without ever making contact with the cabin's heated interior. It was a convection break, and no one believed it mattered. When Emmett tried to explain it to his closest neighbor, a man named Vernon Pike, who'd been building cabins in Montana for 11 years, Vernon just shook his head. "You're spending more time on that thing than you are on your trapline, Emmett. It's canvas. It'll rot by spring. And even if it don't, you're still opening a door. Air moves. You can't stop wind." Emmett didn't argue. He just kept using the tunnel, because the numbers were already starting to show. By mid-December, Emmett's tunnel had become a local joke. It wasn't malicious. Not at first. It was just absurd. In a region where men prided themselves on stone foundations, hand-hewn beams, and chimneys that lasted 50 years, Emmett Carver had attached a floppy tent to his house. At the trading post in Stevensville, a wiry carpenter named Hugh Branson held court. Hugh was the kind of man people listened to. 30 years of building, twice that many winters survived, and a voice that carried like a handsaw through pine. He'd seen Emmett's tunnel, and he had thoughts. "I'll tell you what that is," Hugh said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "That's a man who's afraid of his own front door." Laughter rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Afraid of the wind," more like. Hugh leaned against the counter, warming his hands on a cup of coffee. "You want to keep heat in a cabin? Build a proper vestibule. Planks. Hinges. A real door that don't flap like a flag. That canvas contraption? First heavy snow will rip it clean off. And when it does, he'll be out there in the cold, trying to stitch it back together with frozen fingers, wondering why he didn't just do it right the first time." Heads nodded. It made sense. Of course it made sense. Canvas was temporary. Wood was permanent. This wasn't a debate. It was common knowledge. But the mockery didn't stop at the trading post. Riders passing Emmett's cabin would slow down just to get a better look. Some pointed. Some laughed outright. One freighter, hauling supplies up to the mining camp at Bear Gulch, shouted as he passed, "Hey, Carver, your tent's loose." Emmett, splitting wood by the side of the cabin, didn't look up. He just kept swinging the axe. His neighbor, Vernon Pike, was more direct. He rode over one afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a hatchet, but really to say what everyone else was thinking. "Emmett," Vernon said, reining in his horse near the wood pile, "you know I respect you. But that thing," he gestured at the tunnel, which was swaying in the breeze like a windsock, "that thing makes your whole place look like you've given up." Emmett wiped sweat from his forehead, set down the axe. Given up on what? On doing it proper. A man builds a cabin. He builds it to last. Stone, timber, iron, not whatever that is. It works. Vernon shook his head. It looks like it works. But come February, when the real cold hits, that canvas will freeze stiff as a board. The wind'll tear it, and you'll be colder than the rest of us, 'cause you'll have a hole where your door used to be. Emmett didn't respond. He just picked up the axe and went back to splitting. Vernon rode off, shaking his head. But Vernon was wrong about one thing. February wasn't going to prove Emmett wrong. February was going to prove everyone else wrong. The cold came early in 1882. By mid-January, temperatures in the Bitterroot Valley had dropped below zero and stayed there. Not a quick freeze, a sustained freeze. The kind that turns rivers to stone and makes the air hurt to breathe. Then the wind started. January 16th. A low-pressure system rolled down from Canada, dragging Arctic air like a blade. Sustained winds, 40 miles per hour. Gusts, 55. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero, then 22 below, then 28 below, and it stayed there for 6 days. This wasn't normal cold. This was the kind of cold that killed livestock in their pens, froze water barrels solid, and turned poorly chinked cabins into death traps. Across the valley, families huddled near their stoves, feeding fires day and night. Wood piles shrank. Hand cracked. Sleep became a gamble, because if the fire went out, you woke up to ice on the inside of your walls. And every time someone opened a door, to fetch wood, to check on animals, to step outside for any reason, the wind found them. Hugh Branson, the confident carpenter from Stevensville, spent that week burning through oak faster than he could split it. His cabin had a solid plank vestibule, just like he'd recommended. 2 doors. Proper construction. But the wind didn't care. Every time he opened the outer door, cold air flooded the vestibule. When he opened the inner door, that cold air rushed into the cabin. His wife complained that the temperature dropped so fast, the coffee in her cup went cold before she could finish it. Hugh was burning a cord of wood every 8 days. He was running out. Vernon Pike wasn't doing much better. His cabin, set lower in the valley, caught the wind differently, but it caught it all the same. He stuffed rags around his doorframe, hung a blanket inside, even built a low snow berm against the north wall. Didn't matter. The cold found every crack, every gap, every moment the door swung open. By the 4th day of the freeze, Vernon had burned through half his winter supply. But up at 6,200 feet in the cabin with the ridiculous canvas tunnel, something different was happening. Emmett Carver was fine, better than fine. He was comfortable. The tunnel wasn't just holding. It was working. Every time Emmett needed to go outside to grab firewood from the covered pile 10 feet away, to check the weather, to relieve himself in the snow, he stepped into the tunnel, closed the cabin door behind him, walked 6 feet through the canvas corridor, and opened the outer flap. Cold air rushed into the tunnel, but it didn't rush into the cabin. When he returned, he reversed the process. Outer flap closed. Walked through the tunnel. Opened the cabin door. The warm air inside barely moved. He kept a small thermometer nailed to the wall near his bunk, a mercury glass tube he'd traded for 2 Martin pelts the year before. Throughout the freeze, that thermometer never dropped below 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Not once. His fire burned steady, low, efficient. He was going through 3 logs a day, maybe 4. Meanwhile, his neighbors were splitting frozen wood in the dark, hauling load after load, feeding fires that couldn't keep up. On the 5th day of the freeze, Vernon Pike rode up to Emmett's cabin. His face was chapped red, his hands wrapped in wool that was blackened with soot. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood outside the tunnel, staring at it. The canvas had stiffened in the cold, but it hadn't torn. The willow frame held. The whole structure looked solid, functional, not beautiful, but working. Vernon called out, "Emmett, you in there?" Emmett stepped into the tunnel, opened the outer flap. "Yeah, what do you need?" Vernon blinked. Emmett wasn't wearing a coat, just a wool shirt. His face wasn't windburned. His hands weren't shaking. "You doing all right?" "Doing fine." "How much would you burning?" Emmett paused. 3 for logs a day." "What?" Vernon stared. 3 or 4, yeah. Vernon Pike had been burning 14. He looked at the tunnel, then at Emmett, then back at the tunnel. "That thing actually works?" Emmett nodded. "Keeps the wind out. Keeps the heat in." Vernon stood there for a long moment, wind howling around him, snow stinging his face. Then he said, quiet enough that Emmett almost didn't hear it, "I'll be damned. Stick with me, because you're about to see the exact numbers that made Hugh Branson eat his words and turned a circus tent into the most copied design in 2 counties. Word spread fast in a valley where everyone knew everyone. By the end of the freeze, 3 men had ridden up to Emmett's cabin. Not to mock, not to borrow tools, to measure. The first was a surveyor named Daniel Kutch, who kept meticulous records of weather, temperature, and resource consumption across the valley. He carried a leather-bound notebook everywhere, filled with columns of numbers that most people found tedious, but he found essential. Daniel had heard the rumors. Emmett Carver's cabin was staying warm, impossibly warm, and he was burning almost no wood. Daniel didn't believe it, but he believed in data. He arrived on January 23rd, the day after the freeze finally broke. The wind had died. The temperature had climbed to an almost pleasant 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was out, pale and cold, but out. Emmett was outside, splitting kindling. Daniel dismounted, tied his horse, and got straight to business. "Emmett, I want to measure your cabin." Emmett looked up, axe in hand. "Measure what?" "Temperature, fuel consumption, heat retention. I've been tracking everyone in the valley. You're an outlier." Emmett shrugged. "Measure whatever you want." Daniel stepped into the tunnel first. He paused, looked around. The canvas was stiff with cold, but intact. The willow frame hadn't collapsed. He ran his hand along the interior wall. Frost had formed on the canvas, a thin layer of ice crystals, but the structure was sound. He stepped through the inner flap into the cabin. The difference was immediate. Warm, not roasting, not sweltering, just warm, comfortable. The kind of warmth you forget you're in until you step back outside and remember what cold feels like. Daniel pulled out his pocket thermometer, a brass instrument with a mercury tube, accurate to within 2 degrees. He hung it on a nail near the center of the room, away from the stove, and waited 5 minutes for it to stabilize. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked it again. Same reading. Daniel walked to the corner farthest from the stove. 65 degrees. Near the door, where cold air should have been pooling, where draft should have been leaking in, 64 degrees. He looked at Emmett. "How much wood did you burn during the freeze?" 3 logs a day. Maybe 4 when it got below 20. Daniel wrote that down. Then he asked, "How long do you keep the fire going?" "I bank it at night. Damper it down. Wakes up in the morning, still as coals." "And you're not refueling overnight?" "Not unless it gets real bad." Daniel did the math in his head. 3 to 4 logs per day, over 6 days of sustained freeze. That was roughly 24 logs. Maybe a quarter cord of wood. He knew what Vernon Pike had burned. He knew what Hugh Branson had burned. He'd measured their consumption himself. Vernon, 84 logs in 6 days. Hugh, 96 logs. Emmett had used a quarter of what they'd used, and his cabin was warmer. Daniel flipped to a new page in his notebook. "I need to measure the tunnel." They stepped outside. Daniel paced the length of the tunnel, 8 feet, 2 inches. He measured the diameter of the willow hoops, roughly 5 feet across, 4.5 feet tall. He noted the double-layer canvas, the wax treatment, the wool batting around the doorframe seal. Then he did something Emmett didn't expect. He opened the outer flap of the tunnel, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. He stood there in the canvas corridor for a full minute. When he came back out, he was smiling. "It's a buffer zone." "A what?" "A thermal buffer. When you open the outer flap, cold air enters the tunnel, but it doesn't reach the cabin door. When you open the cabin door, warm air escapes into the tunnel, but it doesn't reach the outside. The tunnel traps the transition. It's not insulation. It's a lock." Emmett nodded slowly. "That's what I figured." Daniel wrote furiously. Then he looked up. "Emmett, do you know what you've done? Built a tunnel. You've solved convection loss. Every cabin in this valley loses 10 to 15 degrees every time someone opens the door. Yours loses maybe 2, maybe 3. That's a 70% reduction in thermal escape. And that means you need 70% less fuel to maintain the same temperature." Emmett blinked. 70%? At least. Daniel closed his notebook. "I'm writing this up. People need to know." But Daniel wasn't the only one measuring. Hugh Branson showed up 2 days later. He didn't announce himself. He just appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing near his horse, staring at the tunnel. He'd been standing there for a while, Emmett figured. Long enough to work up the nerve to actually approach. Emmett stepped outside, saw him, and waved. "Hugh." Hugh didn't move. Just stood there, jaw tight, hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Finally, he walked over. Slow, deliberate, like a man approaching a gallows. When he reached the tunnel, he stopped. He looked at it, really looked at it. The canvas, the willow frame, the way it attached to the cabin. Then he said, quiet, almost too quiet to hear, "I burned through my whole woodpile, Emmett." Emmett didn't say anything. All of it. 2 cords. About maybe a week left, and spring still 6 weeks out. I've been cutting frozen deadfall in the dark, just to keep my family from freezing. Hugh looked at Emmett. His face was wind-burned, exhausted. Proud man, humbled. "I need to know how this works." Emmett gestured to the tunnel. "Go inside. Feel it yourself." Hugh stepped into the tunnel, closed the outer flap, stood there. 10 seconds. 20. Then he opened the cabin door, stepped inside, and felt the warmth hit him like a hand on his chest. He stood there for a long moment, looking around. At the stove, small, banked low. At the thermometer on the wall. At the floor, which wasn't drafty, wasn't cold, wasn't leaking heat into the earth. He stepped back into the tunnel, closed the cabin door, opened the outer flap, and stepped outside. Cold. Immediate. Brutal. But the cabin door was closed, and the cold hadn't followed him inside. Hugh looked at Emmett. "How much did this cost you?" "Canvas I already had. Willow I cut myself. Wool batting cost me $2 at the trading post. Took me a day and a half to build." Hugh did the math. $2. A day and a half of labor. Versus 2 cords of wood. Versus frozen nights. Versus his wife asking him every morning if they were going to make it to spring. Hugh nodded. Once. Sharp. Like a man making a decision. "I'm building one." "Good. But I'm not using canvas. I'm using planks. Hinged. Proper." Emmett smiled. "That'll work too." Hugh mounted his horse, started to ride off. Then he stopped, turned back. "Emmett." "Yeah." "I'm sorry I called you a coward." Emmett nodded. You didn't know." "I should have known. I've been building 30 years. And you, someone who's never built a damn thing in his life. You figure out something I missed." He rode off. But the story didn't end there. Because by the time spring came, half the valley had heard. And once people started measuring, once they saw the numbers, the fuel savings, the temperature retention, they stopped laughing. They started building. By March of 1882, Emmett Carver's circus tent had become the most talked about structure in the Bitterroot Valley. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was revolutionary, because it worked. And in a place where survival wasn't theoretical, where winter killed the careless and rewarded the practical, works was the only standard that mattered. The first copycat appeared 3 weeks after the freeze ended. Vernon Pike, the same man who'd told Emmett his tunnel would freeze and tear, built his own version. Not canvas. Vernon used lumber, planks, hinges, a wooden vestibule with 2 doors. He set it 8 feet out from his cabin, creating an enclosed airlock. It wasn't as flexible as Emmett's design, but didn't need to be. The principle was the same: trap the transition. Vernon tested it for a week, then rode over to Emmett's place. "Drop my fuel consumption by half," he said. No preamble. "I'm keeping 12 degrees more inside, even when the wind's blowing." Emmett nodded. "Told you it worked." "You told me." "I didn't listen." Vernon paused, shifted his weight. Then, "There's 7 families up near Burnt Fork asking me how I built mine. I'm telling them it was your idea. Tell them whatever you want. Just make sure they build it right." Hugh Branson built his next. True to his word, he constructed a solid plank vestibule, double-walled, insulated with sawdust, hinged doors on iron pins that wouldn't freeze. It looked permanent, professional, like something that belonged on a catalog page. It worked just as well as Emmett's canvas tunnel. Hugh started getting requests. People wanted him to build them vestibules. He charged $6 per structure, materials included, and built 11 of them before summer. But not everyone could afford Hugh's craftsmanship. So people improvised. A homesteader named Iris Calloway, a widow raising 3 children on 40 acres, built hers out of salvaged barn siding and a tarp. Crooked, drafty in places, but functional. She reported a 40% reduction in wood consumption over the following winter. A Finnish immigrant named Annie Lottie, who'd settled near Lolo Creek, built his using a technique from the old country, a tulikarapi, or wind cupboard. Double doors, narrow corridor, pegs for coats. He added an innovation Emmett hadn't thought of, a small vent in the ceiling of the corridor that let moisture escape without letting cold air flood in. It worked even better. By the winter of 1883, Daniel Kutch, The surveyor who'd first measured Emmett's cabin published a report in the regional newsletter. It was dry, technical, full of numbers. But the conclusion was clear. Thermal vestibules and airlocks, when properly constructed, reduce convective heat loss by an average of 65 to 80%, resulting in fuel savings between 40 to 70% depending on cabin size, stove efficiency, and exposure to prevailing winds. These structures represent a significant advancement in frontier heating efficiency and should be considered standard practice for high-altitude and high-wind regions. Translation: build a damn vestibule. The report spread. Copies were passed around trading posts, read aloud at community meetings, pinned to the walls of general stores. Within 2 years, 23 cabins in the Bitterroot Valley had some version of Emmett's design. Some used canvas. Some used wood. Some used a hybrid, canvas in summer, planks in winter. But they all shared the same principle. Don't let the wind steal your heat. And the man who'd started it all? Emmett Carver kept trapping marten, kept splitting firewood, kept walking through his canvas tunnel every time he left the cabin. He didn't patent the design, didn't charge for advice, didn't tour the valley giving lectures. He just lived. And when people asked him, when surveyors and builders and homesteaders showed up at his door asking how he'd figured it out, he always gave the same answer. I didn't figure anything out. I just got tired of freezing. But here's the truth no one said out loud. Emmett Carver wasn't smarter than the experienced builders. He wasn't more educated than the engineers. He wasn't a genius. He was just willing to look stupid long enough to test an idea. And in the end, that made all the difference. Because wisdom doesn't always look wise. Sometimes it looks like a floppy canvas tent attached to a cabin door. Sometimes it gets laughed at. Sometimes it gets called a coward's escape, a fool's errand, a waste of time. Until winter comes, and the numbers prove who was right. Emmett's tunnel held warm air all night. It cut fuel consumption in half. It kept families alive when the wind turned savage and the cold turned mean. And all it took was 8 feet of canvas, 12 willow hoops, and a willingness to be wrong in front of everyone. The question is, what are you willing to look stupid for? Because the next time someone laughs at your ridiculous idea, the next time an expert tells you it won't work, it's not practical, it's not how things are done. Remember Emmett Carver. Remember that the best ideas don't always come from the most experienced people. Sometimes they come from the cold, the desperate, and the willing. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? I want to hear your story. And if this made you think differently about old versus new solutions, hit that like button and subscribe. Because every week, I bring you one forgotten technique that actually worked when it mattered most. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.